Wakisashi's Teahouse.
Snowcountry by Yasunari Kawabata, Part 5, page 103. Why can't you? It's wrong of you. Her voice was almost desperate. Then she closed her eyes and began again, as if she had asked herself whether Shimamura knew her, felt her for what she was, and had answered that he did. Once a year is enough. You'll come once a year, won't you, while I'm here? Her contract was for 4 years, she said. When I was at home, I didn't dream I would ever be a geisha again. I even gave away my skis before I left. And so, all I've accomplished, I suppose, has been to give up smoking. I remember how much you used to smoke, now that you mention it. When guests at parties gave me cigarettes, I took them away in my sleeve, and I have a fine collection by the time I'm ready to go home. But 4 years, that's a long time. It will pass in a hurry. Aren't you warm, though? Shimamura took her in his arms, and she came to him. I've always been warm. I suppose the nights will be getting chilly. It's 5 years now since I came here. At first, I wondered how I could live in such a place, especially before the railroad came through. And it's going on 2 years since you first came. He had come 3 times in less than 2 years, and on each new visit he had found Komako's life changed. Crickets were chirping outside in a noisy chorus. I wish they'd be a little quieter. Komako pulled away from Shimamura. The moths at the window started up as the wind came from the north. Shimamura knew well enough that the thick eyelashes made her eyes seem half open, and yet he found himself looking again to be sure. I'm fatter now that I've stopped smoking. The fat on her abdomen was heavier, he had noticed. They had long been apart, but what eluded his grasp when he was away from her was immediately near and familiar when he was beside her again. One is bigger than the other. She cupped her breasts lightly in her hands. I suppose that's a habit of his, one side only. What a nasty thing to say. Here she was. This was it, he remembered. Next time, tell him to treat them both alike. Alike? Shall I tell him to treat them both alike? She brought her face gently towards his. It was a second-floor room, but it seemed to be surrounded by croaking toads. 2 and 3 of them were moving from spot to spot, remarkably long-winded croakers. Back from the bath, Komako began talking of herself. Her voice was quiet and her manner was completely serene. The first physical examination she had had here, she thought it would be as when she was an apprentice geisha, and she bared her chest for a tuberculosis check. The doctor laughed, and she burst into tears. Such were the intimate details she went into. She talked on as Shimamura encouraged her with questions. I'm always exactly on the calendar, 2 days less than a month each time. I don't suppose it keeps you from your parties. You understand such things, do you? Every day she had a bath in the hot spring, famous for its lingering warmth. She walked 2 miles and more between parties at the old spring and the new, and here in the mountains there were few parties that kept her up late. She was therefore healthy and full-bodied, though she did have a suggestion of the low, bunched-up hips so common with geisha, narrow from side to side and wide from front to back. To Shimamura there was something touching about the fact that such a woman could call him back from afar. I wonder if I can have children. And she wondered too if being generally faithful to one man was not the same thing as being married. That was the first Shimamura had heard of the one man in Komako's life. She had known him since she was 16, she said. Shimamura thought he understood now the lack of caution that had at first so puzzled him. She had never liked the man, Komako continued, and had never felt near him, perhaps because the affair had begun when she was down on the coast, just after the death of the man who had paid her debts. But it's certainly better than average if it's lasted 5 years. I've had 2 chances to leave him, when I went to work as a geisha here, and when I moved after the music teacher died. But I've never had the willpower to do it. I don't have much willpower. The man was still down on the coast. It had not been convenient to keep her there, and when the music teacher came back to these mountains, he had left Komako with her. He had been very kind, Komako said, and it made her sad to think that she could not give her whole self to him. He was considerably older than she, and he but rarely came to see her. I sometimes think it would be easiest to break away from him if I were to be really bad. I honestly think so, sometimes. That would never do. But I wouldn't be up to it. It's not in my nature. I'm fond of this body I live in. If I tried, I could cut my 4 years down to 2, but I don't strain myself. I take care of myself. Think of all the money I could make if I really tried. But it's enough if the man I have my contract with hasn't lost money at the end of 4 years. I know about how much it takes each month for an instalment on the loan, and interest, and taxes, and my own keep, and I don't strain myself to make more. If it's a party that doesn't seem worth the trouble, I slip off and go home, and they don't call me late at night, even from the inn, unless an old guest has asked especially for me. If I wanted to be extravagant, I could go on, but I work as the mood takes me. That's enough. I've already paid back more than half the money, and it's not a year yet. But even so, I managed to spend 30 yen or so on myself every month. It was enough if she made 100 yen a month, she said. The month before, the least busy of the year, she had made 60 yen. She had had some 90 parties, more than any other geisha. She received a fixed amount for herself from each party, and the larger number of parties therefore meant relatively more for her and less for the man to whom she was indentured. But she moved busily from one to another as the spirit took her. There was not a single geisha at this hot spring who lost money and had to extend her contract. Komako was up early the next morning. I dreamed I was cleaning house for the woman who teaches flower arranging, and I woke up. She had moved the little dresser over to the window. In the mirror, the mountains were red with autumn leaves, and the autumn sun was bright. This time it was not Yoko he heard, Yoko calling through the door in that voice so clear he found it a little sad. Komako's clothes were brought rather by the little daughter of the man with whom she had her contract. "What happened to the girl?" Shimamura asked. Komako darted a quick glance at him. "She spends all her time at the cemetery, over there at the foot of the ski course. See the buckwheat field, the white flowers, and the cemetery to the left of it?" Shimamura went for a walk in the village when Komako had left. Before a white wall shaded by eaves, a little girl in mountain trousers and an orange-red flannel kimono, clearly brand new, was bouncing a rubber ball. For Shimamura, there was autumn in the little scene. The houses were built in the style of the old regime. No doubt they were there when provincial lords passed down this north country road. The eaves and the verandas were deep, while the latticed paper-covered windows on the second floor were long and low, no more than a foot or so high. There were reed blinds hanging from the eaves. Slender autumn grasses grew along the top of an earthen wall. The pale yellow plumes were at their most graceful, and below each plume narrow leaves spread out in a delicate fountain. Yoko knelt on a straw mat beside the road, flailing at beans spread out before her in the sunlight. The beans jumped from their dry pods like little drops of light. Perhaps she could not see him because of the scarf round her head. She knelt, flailing away at the beans, her knees spread apart in their mountain trousers, and she sang in that voice so clear it was almost sad, the voice that seemed to be echoing back from somewhere. "The butterfly, the dragonfly, the cricket, the pine cricket, bell cricket, horse cricket are singing in the hills." How large the crow is, starting up from the cedar in the evening breeze, so says the poet. Again, there were swarms of dragonflies by the cedar grove Shimamura could see from his window. As the evening approached, they seemed to swim about faster, more restlessly. Shimamura had bought a new guide to these mountains while he was waiting for his train in Tokyo. Thumbing through it, he learned that near the top of one of the border range peaks, a path threaded its way through beautiful lakes and marshes, and in this watery belt, alpine plants grew in the wildest profusion. In the summer, red dragonflies flew calmly about, lighting on a hat or a hand, or the rim of a pair of spectacles, as different from the persecuted city dragonfly as a cloud from a mud puddle. But the dragonflies here before him seemed to be driven by something. It was as though they were wanted desperately to avoid being pulled in with the cedar grove as it darkened before the sunset. The western sun fell on distant mountains, and in the evening light he could see how the red leaves were working their way down from the summits. "People are delicate, aren't they?" Komako had said that morning. "Broken into a pulp, they say, skull and bones and all, and a bear could fall from a higher ledge and not be hurt in the least." There had been another accident up among the rocks, and she'd pointed out the mountain on which it had happened. If man had a tough, hairy hide like a bear, his world would be very different indeed, Shimamura thought. It was through a thin, smooth skin that man loved. Looking out at the evening mountains, Shimamura felt a sentimental longing for the human skin. The butterfly, the dragonfly, the cricket. A geisha had been singing the song to a clumsy shamisen accompaniment as he sat down to an early dinner. The guidebook gave only the most essential information on routes, schedules, lodgings, costs, and left the rest to the imagination. Shimamura had come down from these mountains as the new green was making its way through the last of the snow to meet Komako for the first time, and now, in the autumn climbing season, he found himself drawn again to the mountains he had left his tracks in. Though he was an idler who might as well spend his time in the mountains as anywhere, he looked upon mountain climbing as almost a model of wasted effort. For that very reason, it pulled at him with the attraction of the unreal. When he was far away, he thought incessantly of Komako. But now that he was near her, this sighing for the human skin took on a dreamy quality like the spell of the mountains. Perhaps he felt a certain security. Perhaps he was at the moment too intimate, too familiar with her body. She'd stayed with him the night before. Sitting alone in the quiet, he could only wait for her. He was sure she would come without his calling. As he listened to the noisy chatter of a group of schoolgirls out on their hiking trip, however, he began to feel a little sleepy. He went to bed early. Rain fell during the night, one of those quick showers that come in the autumn. When he awoke the next morning, Komako was sitting primly beside the table, a book open before her. She wore an everyday kimono and cloak. "Are you awake?" Her voice was soft as she turned to him. "What are you doing here? Are you awake?" Shimamura glanced round the room, wondering if she had come in the night without his knowing it. He picked up the watch beside his pillow. It was only 6:30. "You're early." "But the maid has already brought charcoal." A morning-like steam was rising from the tea kettle. "It's time to get up." She sat beside his pillow, the picture of the proper housewife. Shimamura stretched and yawned. He took the hand on her knee and caressed the small fingers, calloused from playing the shamisen. "But it's barely sunrise." "Did you sleep well by yourself?" "Very well." "You didn't grow a moustache after all." "Oh, you did tell me to grow a moustache, didn't you?" "It's all right. I knew you wouldn't. You always shave yourself nice and blue." "And you always look as if you just shaved when you wash away that powder." "Isn't your face a little fatter, though? You were very funny asleep, all round and plump, with your white skin and no moustache." "Sweet and gentle, but unreliable." "You were staring at me then." "I'm not sure I like having people stare at me when I'm asleep." Komako smiled and nodded. Then, like a glow that breaks into a flame, the smile became a laugh. There was strength in the fingers that took his. "I hid in the closet. The maid didn't suspect a thing." "When? How long were you hidden?" "Just now, of course, when the maid came to bring charcoal." She laughed happily at the prank, and suddenly she was red to the ears. As if to hide her confusion, she began fanning herself with the edge of his quilt. Get up, please." "It's cold." Shimamura pulled the quilt away from her. "Are the inn people up yet?" "I've no idea. I came in from the back." "The back?" "I fought my way up from the cedar grove." "Is there a path in the back?" "No, but it's shorter." Shimamura looked at her in surprise. "No one knows I'm here. I heard someone in the kitchen, but the front door must still be locked." "You seem to be an early riser." "I couldn't sleep." "Did you hear the rain?" "It rained?" "That's why the underbrush was wet then. I'm going home. Go on back to sleep." But Shimamura jumped vigorously out of bed, the woman's hand still in his. He went over to the window and looked down at the hill she said she'd come up. Below the shrubbery, halfway down towards the cedar grove, dwarf bamboo was growing in a wild tangle. Directly below the window were rows of taro and sweet potatoes, onions and radishes. It was a most ordinary garden patch, and yet the varied colours of the leaves in the morning sun made him feel that he was seeing them for the first time. The porter was throwing feed to the carp from the corridor that led to the bath. "It's colder and they aren't eating well," he said as Shimamura passed. Shimamura stood for a moment looking at the feed on the water, dried and crumbled silkworms. Komako was waiting for him, clean and prim as before, when he came back from the bath. "It would be good to work on my sewing in a quiet place like this," she said. The room had evidently been cleaned, and the sun poured in on the deepest corners of the slightly worn matting. "You sew, do you?" "What an insulting question. I had to work harder than anyone else in the family. I see now, looking back, that the years when I was growing up were the worst ones of all. She spoke almost to herself, but her voice was tense as she continued. The maid saw me. She gave me a strange look and asked when I'd come. It was very embarrassing, but I couldn't go on hiding in the closet forever. I'm going home. I'm very busy. I couldn't sleep, and I thought I'd wash my hair. I have to wait for it to dry and then go to the hairdresser's. If I don't wash it early in the morning, I'm never ready for an afternoon party. There's a party here too, but they only told me about it last night. I won't come. I've made other promises. I won't be able to see you tonight. It's Saturday and I'll be very busy. She showed no sign of leaving, however. She decided not to wash her hair after all. She took Shimamura down to the back garden. Her deep sandals and stockings were hidden under the veranda where she'd come in. The dwarf bamboo she said she'd fought her way through seemed impassable. Starting down along the garden path toward the sound of the water, they came out on the high river bank. There were children's voices in the chestnut trees. A number of burrs lay in the grass at their feet. Komako stamped them open and took out the fruit. The kernels were small. Kaya plumes waved on the steep slope of the mountain opposite, a dazzling silver in the morning sun. Dazzling, and yet rather like the fleeting translucence that moved across the autumn sky. Shall we cross over? We can see your fiancé's grave. Komako brought herself to her full height and glared at him. A handful of chestnuts came at his face. You're making fun of me. Shimamura had no time to dodge. The chestnuts lashed at his forehead. What possible reason could you have for going to the cemetery? But there's no need to lose your temper. I was completely in earnest. I'm not like people who can do exactly as they want and think of no one else. And who can do that? Shimamura muttered weakly. Why do you have to call him my fiancé? Didn't I tell you very carefully he wasn't? But you've forgotten, of course. Shimamura had not forgotten. Indeed, the memory gave the man Yukio a certain weight in his thoughts. Komako seemed to dislike talking about Yukio. She was not his fiancée, perhaps, but she had become a geisha to help pay doctor's bills. There was no doubt that she had been completely in earnest. Shimamura showed no anger, even under the barrage of chestnuts. Komako looked curiously at him, and her resistance seemed to collapse. She took his arm. You're a simple, honest person at heart, aren't you? Something must be making you sad. They're watching us from the trees. What of it? Tokyo people are complicated. They live in such noise and confusion that their feelings are broken to little bits. Everything is broken to little bits. Even life before long. Shall we go to the cemetery? Well, see, you don't really want to go at all. Oh, but you made such an issue of it. Because I've never once gone to the cemetery. I really haven't gone once. I feel guilty sometimes, now that the teacher's buried there too. But I can't very well start going now. I'd only be pretending. You're more complicated than I am. Why? I'm never able to be completely open with living people, and I want at least to be honest with him, now that he's dead. They came out of the cedar grove, where the quiet seemed to fall in chilly drops. Following the railway along the foot of the ski grounds, they were soon at the cemetery. Some 10 weathered old tombstones and a forlorn statue of Jizo, guardian of children, stood on a tiny island of high ground among the paddies. There were no flowers. Quite without warning, Yoko's head and shoulders rose from the bushes behind the Jizo. Her face wore the usual solemn, mask-like expression. She darted a burning glance at the two of them and nodded a quick greeting to Shimamura. She said nothing. Aren't you early though, Yoko? I thought of going to the hairdresser's. As Komako spoke, a black squall came upon them and threatened to sweep them from their feet. A freight train roared past. Yoko! Yoko! A boy was waving his hat in the door of a black freight car. Saichiro! Saichiro! Yoko called back. It was the voice that had called to the station master at the snowy signal stop. A voice so beautiful it was almost lonely, calling out as if to someone who could not hear on a ship far away. The train passed, and the buckwheat across the tracks emerged fresh and clean as the blind was lifted. The field of white flowers on red stems was quietness itself. The two of them had been so startled at seeing Yoko that they had not noticed the approach of the freight train, but the first shock was dispelled by the train. They seemed still to hear Yoko's voice, and not the dying grumble of the freight train. It seemed to come back like an echo of distilled love. "My brother," said Yoko, looking after the train. I wonder if I should go to the station. But the train won't wait for you at the station, Komako laughed. I suppose not. I didn't come to see Yukio's grave. Yoko nodded. She seemed to hesitate a moment, then knelt down before the grave. Komako watched stiffly. Shimamura looked away towards the jizo. It had 3 long faces, and, beside the hands clasped at its breast, a pair each to the left and the right. I'm going to wash my hair, Komako said to Yoko. She turned and started back along a ridge between the paddies. It was a practice in the snow country to string wooden or bamboo poles on a number of levels from tree trunk to tree trunk, and to hang rice sheaves head down from them to dry. At the height of the harvest, the frames presented a solid screen of rice. Farmers were hanging out rice along the path Shimamura and Komako took back to the village. A farm girl threw up a sheaf of rice with a twist of her trousered hips, and a man high above her caught it expertly, and in one deft sweep of his hand spread it to hang from the frame. The unconscious, practised motions were repeated over and over. Komako took one of the dangling sheaves in her hand and shook it gently up and down, as though she were feeling the weight of a jewel. See how it's headed, and how nice it is to touch. Entirely different from last year's rice. She half closed her eyes from the pleasure. A disorderly flock of sparrows flew low over her head. An old notice was pasted to a wall beside the road. Pay for field hands, 90 sen a day, meals included. Women 40% less. There were rice frames in front of Yoko's house too, beyond the slightly depressed field that separated the house and the road. One set of frames was strung up high in a row of persimmon trees, along the white wall between the garden and the house next door, while another, at right angles to it, followed the line between the field and the garden. With an opening for a doorway at one end, the frames suggested a makeshift little theatre covered not with the usual straw mats, but with unthreshed rice. The taro in the field still sent out powerful stems and leaves, but the dahlias and roses beyond were withered. The lotus pond with its red carp was hidden behind the screen of rice, as was the window of the silkworm room where Komako had lived. Bowing her head sharply, almost angrily, Yoko went in through the opening in the headed rice. Does she live alone? Shimamura asked, looking after the bowed figure. I imagine not. Komako's answer was a little tart. But what a nuisance. I'll not go to the hairdresser's after all. You say things you have no business saying, and we ruin her visit to the cemetery. You're only being difficult. Is it really so terrible to run into her at the cemetery? You have no idea how I feel. If I have time later, I'll stop by to wash my hair. I may be late, but I'll stop by. It was 3 a.m. Shimamura was awakened by a slamming as though someone were knocking the doors loose. Komako lay stretched out on top of him. I said I would come and I've come, haven't I? I said I'd come and I've come, haven't I? Her chest, even her abdomen, rose and fell violently. You're dead drunk. Haven't I? I said I'd come and I've come, haven't I? You have indeed. Couldn't see a thing on the way. Not a thing. Oh, my head aches. How did you manage to get up the hill? I have no idea, not the slightest. She lay heavily across his chest. He found it a little oppressive, especially when she turned over and arched her back, but, too suddenly awakened, he fell back as he tried to get up. It was an astonishingly hot object that his head came to rest on. You're on fire. Oh, fire for a pillow. See that you don't burn yourself. I might very well. He closed his eyes and the warmth sank into his head, bringing an immediate sense of life. Reality came through the violent breathing, and with it a sort of nostalgic remorse. He felt as though he were waiting tranquilly for some undefined revenge. I said I'd come and I've come. She spoke with the utmost concentration. I've come, and now I'm going home. I'm going to wash my hair. She got to her knees and took a drink of water in great swallows. I can't let you go home like this. I'm going home. I have some people waiting. Where did I leave my towel? Shimamura got up and turned on the light. Don't! She hid her face in her hands, then buried it, hands and all, in the quilt. She had on a bold, informal kimono with a narrow undress obi, and under it a nightgown. Her under-kimono had slipped down out of sight. She was flushed from drink, even to the soles of her bare feet, and there was something very engaging about the way she tried to tuck them out of sight. Evidently she'd thrown down her towel and bath utensils when she came in. Soap and combs were scattered over the floor. "Cut! I brought scissors." "What do you want me to cut?" "This." She pointed at the strings that held her Japanese coiffure in place. "I tried to do it myself, but my hands wouldn't work. I thought maybe I could ask you." Shimomura separated the hair and cut at the strings, and as he cut, she shook the long hair loose. She was somewhat calmer. "What time is it?" 3:00. "Not really. You'll be careful not to cut the hair, won't you?" "I've never seen so many strings." The false hair that filled out the coiffure was hot where it touched her head. "Is it really 3:00? I must have fallen asleep when I got home. I promised to come for a bath with some people, and they stopped by to call me. They'll be wondering what's happened." "They're waiting for you?" "In the public bath. 3 of them. There were 6 parties, but I only got to 4. Next week will be very busy with people coming to see the maple leaves. Thanks very much." She raised her head to comb her hair, now long and flowing, and she laughed uncertainly. Funny, isn't it? Unsure what to do with herself, she reached to pick up the false hair. "I have to go. It's not right to keep them waiting. I'll not come again tonight." "Can you see your way home?" "Yes." But she tripped over the skirt of her kimono on the way out. At 7 and again at 3 in the morning, twice in one short day she'd chosen unconventional hours to come calling. There was something far from ordinary in all this, Shimomura told himself. Guests would soon be coming for the autumn leaves. The door of the inn was being decorated with maple branches to welcome them. The porter, who was somewhat arrogantly directing operations, was fond of calling himself a migrant bird. He and his kind worked the mountain resorts from spring through to the autumn leaves and moved down to the coast for the winter. He did not much care whether or not he came to the same inn each year. Proud of his experience in the prosperous coast resorts, he had no praise for the way the inn treated its guests. He reminded one of a not-too-sincere beggar as he rubbed his hands together and hovered about prospective guests at the station. "Have you ever tasted one of these?" he asked Shimomura, picking up a pomegranate-like akebi. "I can bring some in from the mountains if you like." Shimomura, back from a walk, watched him tie the akebi, stem and all, to a maple branch. The freshly cut branches were so long that they brushed against the eaves. The hallway glowed a bright, fresh scarlet. The leaves were extraordinarily large. As Shimomura took the cool akebi in his hand, he noticed that Yoko was sitting by the hearth in the office. The innkeeper's wife was heating sake in a brass boiler. Yoko, seated opposite her, nodded quickly in answer to each remark. She was dressed informally, though she did not have on the everyday mountain trousers. Her plain woolen kimono was freshly washed. "That girl is working here?" Shimomura asked the porter nonchalantly. "Yes, sir. Thanks to all of you, we've had to take on extra help." "You, for instance?" "That's right. She's an unusual type, though, for a girl from these parts." Yoko worked only in the kitchen, apparently. She was not yet serving at parties. As the inn filled, the voices of the maids in the kitchen became louder, but he did not remember having heard Yoko's clear voice among them. The maid who took care of his room said that Yoko liked to sing in the bath before she went to bed, but that, too, Shimomura had missed. Now that he knew Yoko was in the house, he felt strangely reluctant to call Komako. He was conscious of an emptiness that made him see Komako's life as beautiful but wasted, even though he himself was the object of her love. And yet the woman's existence, her straining to live, came touching him like naked skin. He pitied her, and he pitied himself. He was sure that Yoko's eyes, for all their innocence, could send a probing light to the heart of these matters, and he somehow felt drawn to her too.
Wakisashi's Teahouse. Please subscribe.